Now, I want to take you to a report that was done, and I think you are one of the co-authors. I'll have it put up on screen for you. It's a September 2009 paper that was written by NGO Monitor, and as I said, you're one of the authors. It's titled Experts or Ideologues. You have a second screen in front of you which would show it? Yes?
Yes, I have it.
Yes, right.
I have it in my hand and I see it on the screen.
Okay. Now, earlier you mentioned that there was some work that was done to look at what Human Rights Watch did in terms of their reports on Israel. And would this be one of those reports?
This is one of the, I would say, most intensive research reports that I've been involved in.
Yes.
And the organization that I founded, NGO Monitor, as a research project, was carefully done. It took a number of months to do. And I stand by every word that's in it. I think it was an important contribution.
Yes, and I think so. I've been through it. I'd like to take you through some parts of it and then invite your comments. So if you could start with, you will see the page numbers at the side of the page. If you start with page 7 on funding, there's a subsection called funding on page 7.
I have the print, yes.
Yes. The first paragraph after the heading funding sets out what HRW assets total, and it's 122 million, and that was in 2008. Its annual spending exceeded 42 million, of which 31.8 went to program services and so on. That sort of buttresses what you said earlier about the budgets that they have or they operate under. The next paragraph, although HRW claims to refuse funding from government organizations, Oxfam Novib, funded largely by the Dutch government, provided approximately 1 million in 2008, and so on. A highly controversial HRW dinner held in May 2009 in Riyadh, that included members of the government Shura Council, has been described as a fundraising event. Now, just using those few paragraphs as parameters, could you just elaborate on this and how HRW is funded?
This report was written, the data is from 2008. I will just note that now we're 10 years later and the latest funding figures are almost double. They're 75 million. This money is a mix of, it's largely private money. Since the report was written, Human Rights Watch, and I think because of the report, Human Rights Watch has stopped publishing a detailed list of its donors and its sources of income. But the George Soros Open Society Institute is a major funder. We know publicly that they pledged $100 million over a number of years, and that may be the largest source of funding. NGOs are an industry, and industries raise money, and a quarter of their budget is devoted to fundraising. And some of that money does come from governments, as noted, Oxfam Novib, which is itself funded by the Dutch government, as well as other private philanthropies. So they have a very effective fundraising machine. They did not publish details on whether or not they received money from governments, other than they also they had an event, I guess I'll call it, in Libya during the Gaddafi period, and they may or may not have received funding in that context.
Right.
It is an industry, and I'll say that in general. I'll let you if you want to focus me further on that, please go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'd like you to move on to page 10, which deals with the staff and board members of HRW, just to get your comment on this. Because you say here at page 10, starting from the top, that HRW activity concerning Israel exhibits a strong and consistent bias, reflecting a post-colonialist ideological paradigm which a priori defines Palestinians as victims and paints Israel as the perennial aggressor. Over the next paragraph, such blatant prejudice inherent in the structure of this NGO is entirely inconsistent with the rigorous objective investigations that HRW claims to undertake and publish. What can you say about this in the context of the staffing and the makeup of HRW itself?
HRW is, I would say, is more than typical of the NGO human rights network and in this case, they were one of the first in this area. Although they make the claim to rigorous objective investigations, if one looks at their staffing, you see very often, very clearly, that they focus on a few issues. And they do that because those are the issues which conform to their ideology, which I would define as a radical, I don't like the term left and right, but I think in this case it's probably a shorthand form, a radical left-wing ideology. They focus their targets on the basis of that ideology, but also on the basis of media. If the media is covering a story, then they will be very much more involved and they will pump up the story. In the case of Africa, where there's almost no media coverage of very terrible examples of civil wars and killing violations of human rights, but that gets little media, they won't be there, or they'll have very limited analysis of that. And we can analyze the number of pages, the number of quotes, and that's what we did in this situation, as well as where their budget goes in the different areas. And so one sees a very, very strong emphasis, a disproportionate emphasis on the Middle East, far more than other areas. I would also add what's not in this section of the report, if perhaps was done after this report. The founder of Human Rights Watch, a gentleman by the name of Robert Bernstein, wrote an article, an op-ed piece, an opinion piece in the New York Times, in which he denounced his own organization for losing its moral compass. Mm-hmm. And I think that's based on the data that was provided in this report of the bias, of the ideological distortions that are very much predominant in the Human Rights Watch framework.
I'd like to take you to page 22, under the heading Part 2, the Research Facade, and ask you to look at a couple of paragraphs here before I ask for your comment. You have it? Yes, this paper says here, the following examination of some of HRW's research reports on Israel and related press statements demonstrates a consistent pattern of methodological distortion, deviations from universal human rights norms, and sweeping conclusions based on inadequate and/or insufficient evidence. The reports, the lengthy Palestinian testimonies which they include, and the recommendations on which they are based are violations of best practices standards for human rights fact-finding, as detailed in the London Guidelines. And thereafter, you have a couple of bullet points where you say that the studies reflect the following. 1, double standards with inconsistent definitions and applications regarding human shields, collective punishments, use of evidence, etc. 2, reliance on eyewitnesses with limited credibility due to inherent agendas or intimidation, acceptance of unverifiable evidence provided by Palestinian officials while rejecting Israeli evidence as inherently biased. 3, reliance on local political NGOs. 4, distortion of international legal standards and rhetoric in an attempt to justify biased claims and double standards. 5, artificially narrow focus using questionable technical claims regarding the use of specific weapons and tactics. And 6, repeated campaigns for ostensibly independent investigations focusing on allegations only against Israel, with the knowledge that these investigations are often guided by their own biased mandates, employ double standards, and rely on staff with partisan agendas. These are your observations on the findings of HRW. Would that be right?
That is correct. It's a summary of those particular case studies that are examined in this report.
And would you care to elaborate on the basis on which you have come to these conclusions?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question? I didn't quite hear it.
No, I asked you if you would be able to elaborate on the basis on which you have come to these conclusions.
This particular chapter has a number of case studies in it, extending from in the period of 2006, and this is only from 2006 through 2008 or 9. This is only a small part of the research that we were able to collect, where Human Rights Watch made statements, claiming statements of fact, on which they had no basis for making those conclusions. They were, one could argue, I'll use this a little bit less academically rigorous, that they circled the target and then they sent the research to hit the weapon. They circled the target. They wanted to prove that Israel was guilty, and then they went and looked for the evidence that might convince people who were already convinced that this was the case, instead of looking at all the evidence in a objective and professional manner. So the incidents which are listed in there are 5 of them, go through very specific sequence of events. Human Rights Watch, like other NGOs, but in particular this group, holds press conferences. And they make very strong accusations, condemnations in those about facts and also about international law. And they issue reports, and then they go from embassy to embassy and journalist to journalist, and they market their product.
Right.
In all of these cases, within a period of 6 months to a year, the evidence that they had was shown to be false. But there's no penalty for that. And so we put all of these pieces together, and we demonstrated a consistent pattern of failure in fact-finding, failure in evaluation, inconsistency within their own reports. Very often in the press conference, they will say one thing. They will say, we know this because we have this evidence, this piece of metal which has a certain stamping which we got from a pathological institute. And when it's examined, that's an interpretation of a very ambiguous piece of information. The institute from which they claim to have received the information turns out to be either non-existent or to be in some ways a false, just a facade. In other words, not a pathological institute in any way, but simply designed for soft power warfare, and et cetera, et cetera. We see this repeatedly, this pattern, and that's the basis for those conclusions as we present in this detailed report.
Thank you, Prof. Steinburg. In your view, would the way in which the board and staffing of HRW have taken place, as well as its funding and donor links, would that have anything to do with the way in which it would influence its outcome in terms of the reports and the conclusions?
Well, I missed again the volume's a little bit low. Could you just repeat the end of it? Would it have anything to do with?
Now, I was going to ask you whether the way in which it is funded, the way it has links with donors, the way in which it employs its staff and its board composition, would that have anything to do with the outcomes as we see in the report?
The primary funder today of Human Rights Watch has a very specific set of political and ideological objectives. And the individuals who are on the staff, as well as in a broad sense in the way in which they function, are consistent with that ideology. I don't think any organization that relies on donations from people who are politically or ideologically identified and committed will do something that will be inconsistent with that ideology. So funding makes a difference. The staffers are, and I will focus primarily on the Middle East region, what they call MENA, Middle East and North Africa, which is the area that I focused on in most detail. First of all, the top of that organization, the people who run that organization, have not changed in 15 years. Their backgrounds are all in political ideology. And they have hired people in that time frame at lower levels who are consistent with that particular ideology, that particular bias, that particular set of political objectives and soft power warfare framework. And so we see people who are experts in military activities which they claim to report on. That's important to note. At one time, Human Rights Watch had one military analyst, a senior military analyst. He was not experienced in particular. He did spend some time at the U.S. Pentagon in related areas, and it was very problematic, his conclusions. But since that person was no longer working it, I won't go into the details, but those are public record. For many years, Human Rights Watch has not had a military analyst. The people who write these reports know nothing about military situations. They know nothing about terror situations. They know nothing about military intelligence. And they've hired other people like that. What they are is a political organization, and they hire other people who are politically committed, ideologically committed to a certain position. And that's not only true for Israel, but it's throughout that division of Human Rights Watch, and I suspect true for other divisions as well.
I understand. So we have a report that is flawed in so many fundamental ways that you've just outlined, designed to fit a particular outcome, as you've described, and you, I think, used the words distorted and in some cases untrue conclusions. When you have this kind of information designed to fit a particular political agenda and then carried extensively on internet, social media, and so on, would that be something that one has to be very wary of? Because these are the kind of information that ultimately influence political opinion, divide countries, affect their national interests, social cohesion, and ultimately could have the effect of bringing down a country. Would you care to comment?
All of the scenarios that you described are ones that we have seen in different conditions. With your permission, I'll focus on the social cohesion issue. Countries which are pluralistic, multicultural, have different population groups, and I will specifically talk about my own country, Israel, where we have approximately 25% of the population are Arab Israeli citizens, and within that group we have Christians, Muslims, Druze, other Circassians, other minorities, and there is clearly a process that takes place. Human Rights Watch is, in many instances, been a leader in this process of creating situations that are designed to divide the country, to help exacerbate some of the issues or the points of friction that exist in a very complex situation. And when we have, for instance, whether from the inside the country or outside of terrorist incidents, and then Israel is condemned falsely for killing civilians in responding or for violations of international law, that very much creates a situation which inflames internal social points of friction. So the term social cohesion, I think, is very important, and this process of trying to use soft power, I apologize for coming back to that term, but it's a very shorthand form that is used a lot, and I've heard I think other witnesses that you've heard have used the same term, using soft power in order to create and expand the points of friction within a society like this.
Right.
It's something that is of great deal of concern, and it is also concern in other countries where these types of processes are taking place.
Well, Singapore is not dissimilar to the scenario you outlined because we are racially, religiously, culturally diverse, and we coexist as one, and lots of care and deliberate policy making have come into creating this situation. And these are significant fault lines, which are not just emotive, but they are, I think, fault lines which, if divided or acted upon, could have very significant bearing on undermining our national security interests. So I understand what you've been saying, and putting everything together, what we've said about the speed at which this is pervade false information, this kind of socially divisive, culturally divisive reports designed to undermine that cohesion. Would you accept that one therefore needs to be very careful with how we allow the proliferation of this kind of information online, which carries much faster, as you've said in your report?
I start with a realistic understanding of the process and the situation and all the factors. I try to, at least as an academic.
Yes.
I also, a term that we have not used in this discussion, but I'd like to introduce it, is the term intelligence. Intelligence, particularly in the sense of military intelligence in this case, that one, in trying to counter this process, being aware of what is being planned and how the processes work are essential to effective responses. And creating a situation in which there are resources devoted precisely to collecting that information, just as one would if one was monitoring the beginnings of what looked like a terrorist cell that was growing. Mm-hmm. And you want to check to see and know if they are in the process of obtaining explosives and other weapons. This is a weaponized process. And one has to know, do the intelligence that's necessary. Again, I come back to the Israeli case where I would say for 10 years, the resources in this area were lacking. the resources in understanding digital diplomacy, or digital, well, I would say the counter. Now there is a branch that's involved for digital diplomacy, and in the foreign ministry and in other ministries that coordinate. And so I would say the concerns that you outlined are extremely real, and the best way to counter them is to understand the process in detail, have people whose entire professional career definition is focused on this issue, so that they can work and be constantly monitoring and then use the tools that are available to both prevent, when possible, the placement, the posting, the publication of false claims, and also the analysis that goes with it. And then as it's like a fire, a wildfire that goes from one point to the viral process. To be prepared for that. Because when these claims are made, it's not just the media, we haven't talked about this at all, but they will then come up in the United Nations Human Rights Council. Yes. Because the NGOs are very active there, and they will often find a very warm and inviting environment to repeat those claims and allegations. And it's important to know how to deal with each one of these battlefields in an effective manner, and it's a learning process. It's a learning process that also involves countries together. There is a serious effort being made to combine and coordinate the information that's gained. We win a few battles, we lose a few battles. We need to make sure that we win more and lose less.
Right. Thank you very much, Prof. Steinburg. That's all I have for you. I'm not sure if my colleagues may have some questions. I'll leave it back to the chairman. Thank you.
Okay. As there are no further questions, Professor Steinburg, thank you very much for your contributions. We appreciate it. We'll send you a transcript of today's proceedings. If there are any corrections to be made, please make the corrections and send the transcripts back to us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I might, I'd like to thank your committee. I think what you're doing is extremely important, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak before you.
Right.
Thank you.
Before we move to the next witness, I would like to place a number of facts on the record. Now, this committee has heard the PAP Policy Forum, PPF, and NGO Monitor make serious criticisms against Human Rights Watch. In particular, PPF's written representation has criticized HRW's report on Kill the Chicken to Scare the Monkeys, suppression of free expression and assembly in Singapore, and pointed out that the report contains many falsehoods. Now, before hearing this evidence, we had unanimously decided at our meeting on the 5th of March to invite Human Rights Watch to give oral evidence. HRW initially agreed to give evidence. It agreed to come on the 23rd of March, 2018. HRW was then informed that its representative should be able to deal with the questions on its report. Now, once it was notified of this, HRW replied that, and I quote, "Since our last communication, the staff member best able to address these issues has made other travel plans and that cannot be changed," end quote. Parliament Secretariat subsequently offered to fund the costs of HRW's representative flying in, or to arrange for video conferencing at any time between the 15th to the 29th of March, that is over a period of 14 days. But HRW has indicated that it remains unavailable to give oral evidence either in person, through one of its officers, or via video conference. I've asked Parliament Secretariat to issue a chronology of the exchange with HRW. And for the record, our invitation to HRW still stands. Should HRW decide that it is willing to give oral evidence to defend its report, whether in person or video conferencing, it is welcome to write to us. Thank you.